Manvir Singh has been on The Gist before, and I think he'll be on The Gist again. Well, depending on how this one goes. He's an assistant professor of anthropology at the University of California, Davis. He writes really interesting, eye-opening things for The New Yorker, but he had his third eye opened, I don't want to be glib about it, in his studies as an anthropologist. And he has written a new book on the topic, and among the communities that he's lived with and investigated, it is called Shamanism, the Timeless Religion. Manvir, welcome back to The Gist.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me back, Mike.
Tell me about this Indonesian community that you lived with, embedded with, only took a backpack with you to spend some time with.
Yeah, so I first visited them. They're called the Mentawai. I first visited them in 2014, and I have been going back for a decade. So actually, I was there this past summer, and my assistant and very good friend Rustam, the first summer I went to, he had just had a newborn baby, and now this kid is 10 years old, which is kind of mind-boggling. But anyway, yeah, so I first had gone there to really investigate whether I could do anthropological fieldwork. So I was a new graduate student, and I was interested in studying indigenous law and indigenous religion. And I had read about this island chain off the west coast of Sumatra where they had shamanism and they had local justice courts. And I went there and I discovered a world that has really redirected my life and my interests. That first summer was a struggle, as I talk about in the book. I got there. I had planned on staying with a community for that summer, becoming ensconced, learning the language. And, 5 days in, I was like, this is impossible. All of my belongings were covered with fungus. I was exhausted. I was alone. And I ended up convincing myself that a project there was impossible, and I left. But anyway, I changed my mind soon afterwards, and I went back. And while I've been revisiting and spending time with that community and learning the language, the thing that I have consistently been the most fascinated by and spent most of my time investigating has been shamanism. And this institution that turned out to be so important there, I later discovered has been important in societies around the world and still echoes in our own context. So it was those experiences that eventually concluded with this book.
Well, one of your most recent articles in The New Yorker was asking how much sway does our language have over our thinking. So, well, tell me about language acquisition. Why do you think you'd be good at it? And as you've gone for 10 years, how your understanding of the language opened up your understanding of the culture. And maybe you look back in year 10 saying, I wasn't really understanding anything in years 2 through 4. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot there.
I like to ask 7-part questions. Yeah.
No, appreciate it. So your first question was like, did I think I would be good at it? And I don't know if I had a great sense of how good I would be. And I honestly, that first year and much of the second year kept feeling like this was impossible. Like, I'm just being confronted with a wall of uninterpretable, language. And it really felt very daunting. But, I'm very interested in culture and religion and law, how people are understanding their spiritual world and their political world. And so if ever I wanted to make progress in that and have any kind of important insight, I knew I had to learn the language. And so I really prioritized it. Learning the language has been very eye-opening, and it has definitely been the case that what I thought was going on in the beginning has totally been transformed in a number of ways. So one, very trivially, if you go back and you look at my first summer, I was keeping a dictionary where I'm literally learning words from children, like children would point to something. And I have a daughter right now and she's learning language, and it's an interesting parallel where, I would maybe think something meant delicious when it actually meant like, give me water. Or
okay, at least it wasn't poisonous.
Yeah. But over time, of course, I've learned more. But But another really important aspect of how to learn language and how to learn communication is just like becoming accustomed to an entirely different set of norms. And so there were things in the beginning. So the Mentawai are very touchy, and they're very crass. They talk a lot about each other's genitalia.
Not sensitive, but they'll squeeze your biceps, for instance.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, they'll squeeze my biceps. They'll massage my arm while I'm sitting there. They'll talk about my penis pretty openly. And so, honestly, in the beginning, there were several times where I thought people were coming on to me, and I didn't really know, I'm still also figuring out like the sexual norms. And then later I just realized, okay, no, this is just open and physical and intimate in a way that I was just not ready for, or just
that one great shaman you talk about, he just has a penchant for penis jokes. I mean, which occurs in Western society too, right?
Yeah,
like there's a continuum of people who like penis jokes. Yeah,
yeah, there definitely is. Yeah. My main friend and assistant Rustam makes very, very few penis jokes, but there are some who really enjoy it. But so over the course of the last 10 years, one way I've learned more about what they're meaning to communicate has just been learning the norms. But there is also definitely a way in which learning the language gives you insight into kind of how they see the world. And so one example is the word sky. The word sky is manua. But then you start to realize that the concept of sky and kind of the spirits related to the sky suffuses a lot of how they think about the world. So the word for life is urimanua. It shares the same root as sky. The word for the word for alive is urimanua. The word for life is purimanuajat. The word for a dead person is rusa manua, sky wind. There are many ways to talk about dead people, but one of them is sky wind. So that's one way, kind of seeing how these concepts metaphorically work in different contexts. Another way that I've really come to appreciate their cultural world by learning the language has just been how much they use metaphor in everyday speech. And so one example is I was sitting at a mediation. So someone had accidentally killed someone else's cow. It was the only cow in a very large distance. It was a huge event. But during the mediation, the mediator talked about talking drums. So in Mentawai, if someone dies or if you find an animal, you beat out a rhythm on a drum that has 3 tones, like, and that can mean like I have a male or an elderly woman died. It depends on the context. But he said something like, as we're talking, let's use the talking drum as an example. When you want to communicate with the talking drum, you cannot only hit one drum. You need to hit several drums. That's the only way you can send a message. In the same way, during this mediation, let's have everyone speak, not a single person hitting one note. And I found that a really striking moment, and it was also, I think my language was improving because it gave me a better appreciation, for just like how interesting and rich communication is, but also the ways in which different aspects of their life are understood in relation to each other in a way that's very different. If I'm talking about the best way to mediate, I would never think about the tones of an instrument. Yeah, right. Which is only to say, right, I think learning the language has really given me insight into a world that I otherwise would not have, and I'm incredibly glad that I did that.
Yeah, though there are analogs to a mediation and the way a mediator, say, in a Western context would talk to the people that the mediator was dealing with might involve direct instruction about literally the tone to use, right? And that's not so far off. Like, well, you were using it to mean let us hear from different voices. But things about tone and things about how to strike the right note, these are words and phrases and metaphors for a reason. Just an observation.
For sure.
Tell me, yeah.
Well, tell me about
go ahead.
No, I mean, your point actually just reminds me of one other thing where I think that first summer I appreciated both how different they were, but also how incredibly familiar the social world was. And in many ways, the world was more familiar than I had expected. And that's one example, but Yeah, I don't want to overstate difference at the same time, because
that is a through line. That is a through line through the book about shamanism, that you're literally living with and investigating shamans, but you're also seeing how much of an analogy, or not even an analogy, like working in the same way the shamanism, the ideas work in Western society with hedge fund managers or CEOs. But I do want to ask a question or two more about the Mentawai themselves. How important is shamanism in their life, and do they use it? Is it the thing they first grasp for in lieu of medicine, healing medicine, Western medicine? That's my question.
Yeah, so it's incredibly important in their life. So it's very important for healing. I mean, it's really the central institution in healing. But the shamans are also very important as mediators, as kind of spiritual intermediaries. So if you are inaugurating a new house, you might invite in shamans, and they'll have a ceremony to essentially acquaint all of the materials of the house with each other. In terms of where shamanism exists in relation to Western medicine, so I think that's incredibly variable, and it depends on the village, and it's changing so much that I'm pretty cautious, I think, about saying one thing. I will say, so the data that I've collected shows that of the people who go to shaman ceremonies, 50% also go to the local village health post. A similar number are seeking out herbal remedies on their own. So it's a very kind of like, people are trying lots of things at the same time after illness, but I think the shaman institution or shamanism is very important. I will say something that people have said for discouraging them from using shamans increasingly is how expensive shamans are compared to getting medicine at the village health post. At the same time, they think that medicine at the village health post is far less effective. And so that continues them going to these shamans.
Is there a shaman HMO? Is there
a shaman HMO? Yeah. That's an interesting question. I mean, your family is kind of like your HMO, and so far as like insurance and risk are distributed through a social network. Yeah. So when I am calling a shaman, I'm calling on a network to help me kill pigs,
But also, so when you say expensive, the listener might be thinking, oh, in terms of something other than money. And that's true. They require tribute and time and attention and all this, but they also do require money in at least the community that you lived in.
Well, so primarily the cost is in sacrificing animals. So, I mean, if you are someone who doesn't have pigs, you'll have to buy a pig, but they get the main cost. The thing that makes a shaman ceremony so expensive is that if you want a very good treatment, then you have to be sacrificing pigs.
Yeah, yeah. And so I think a Westerner would say, okay, so this explains some of what's going on. Once you make that sacrifice, you have so much riding on the outcome, and there's, high suggestibility, and it's a version of the
endowment effect?
The variation I was going to say on the placebo effect.
Right.
Yeah. But that's not exactly it. I mean, that's not what I'm gleaning from your book, is precisely explains it all.
No. Well, I mean, I think... So I'll say when I went there and was thinking about shamanism, I think the first analogy I was thinking about was doctors. And I was thinking about a shamanic healing ceremony as roughly analogous to you going to a doctor. After attending a bunch of those healing ceremonies, one thing I'll say is that they feel much more like parties than they do like... I mean, so there is a good amount of treatment, but, I'll give you an example. You call a shaman or a bunch of shamans. Over the course of the day, they might do some treatments. You might kill some chickens, and then you might sacrifice a pig. You'll invite a lot of family over. The shamans will dance for a long time. They'll enter trance. They will heal you. But at some point, they will leave the dance floor. Then your family will get up and start dancing. And then this is no longer for healing you. This is just like, this is a great time. People are drinking coffee, trying to stay up all night. It's an interesting thing because I mean, there are many lessons I've taken from studying shamanism, but one of them is that there are many paradigms for how to heal people, and the degree to which we treat healing as something that is solemn versus celebratory is something that I've noticed is very different in at least this context.
Very interesting. So, in an analogy to language acquisition, while one learns a language, first they're essentially translating it to the language they're most comfortable in, and then eventually you start thinking in that language, and it's not a method of translation. You're a trained anthropologist or a young anthropologist at this point, and you know not to analogize everything to your experience in the West, but there's still some of that has to go on. And plus you're writing to an audience that is not on an island in Indonesia, but, back in the West or in the academy. So what about that? Did over time you begin to see what was going on as less of an analogy to things that went on in America or in, the exalted places of academia?
Yeah, well, so I think I started thinking about the analogies differently. So I think in the beginning I was like, what kinds of figures are shamans like? Are they like doctors? Should I think about shamanism as a kind of guild? But then with time, I think it became more about like, what are the dynamics and processes at play and what are the analogies? So just one example is I've thought about, read about, researched a bunch about the initiatory transformation that a shaman undergoes. So in many contexts, to become a shaman, you have to undergo dramatic initiations. You have to often undergo some kind of transformation. So in Mentawai, a big part of the transformation is treating your eyes so that you have new eyes. And something that helped me think about that and has helped me really communicate that is superhero narratives, where these superhero narratives hinge on an origin myth where a regular person undergoes some fundamental transformation. They come out fundamentally different and changed, and that fundamental transformation is linked to the fact that they have powers normal humans do not. And I think this same dynamic, that of a fundamental, essential transformation to make more tenable this understanding of special powers, is at play in shamanism. So that's just, there are many other of these kinds of examples or analogies that I've been thinking about, but I think a major lesson has been less to kind of look for explicit one-to-one analogies and more to think about shamanism as kind of at the nexus of a lot of psychology and social dynamics that are also play around the world and in other contexts, if that's clear.
Because you're an anthropologist, do you think that analogies come to you easily? Because reading your book, it's rife with analogies. You follow around these shamans like a prepubescent following around their older brothers, or shamanistic theory is the blue cheese of archaeology. Some love it, some can do without it. I would say there are more analogies per page in your book than in most nonfiction books I read.
That's funny. Yeah, I don't know if that's because I'm an anthropologist. Perhaps.
Maybe you're an anthropologist because you think in analogies rather than the other way around.
Possibly. Yeah. I would say that for much of my adult life, I did a lot of performance poetry and spoken word poetry. And that was kind of a world where there was a lot of like training oneself to be attentive to analogies and interesting comparisons. And so maybe that has predisposed a certain proclivity.
So let's jump to the second half of the book, which is you finding shamanism or examples thereof all throughout the rest of the world. Did you always know that you were going to go in that direction? That seems to be why we want anthropology to exist, to explain that stuff that's going on in far-flung corners of the world that we wouldn't have exposure to us who are here in the Western world.
Yeah, for sure. I think something that got me very excited about anthropology from the beginning was thinking about kind of, there's even like an image that comes to mind, which is like a grid of the world where you can see both this interplay of diversity and universality, where you can see the dazzling, incredible variety of human culture and human expression, but then discern these underlying threads. That was an aesthetic, that was like an intellectual project that I found incredibly compelling, that really motivated me to work on this. And so, I think as soon as I started working on shamanism and thinking about the processes that developed it, I was very interested in how it manifests around the world.
Yeah. So, what are some insights that maybe go against what was assumed before? Where are you rebutting? Yeah, the collective wisdom.
So there are a couple. Speaking of analogy, I talk about in the book, and who knows to what extent this resonates with certain generations, but what I call the Pokemon theory of religious history or religious evolution. And this is this claim that you see so often where shamans are treated essentially as some kind of like earlier precursor in religious evolution or religious history. And there are a lot of writers who I very much respect and enjoy who invoke that kind of imagery or that kind of a metaphor. And
we had to evolve from the shamans, or don't look down on the shamans. This, there's a shared ancestry.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I didn't understand that Squirtle becomes a, more developed monster, but that's the Pokemon theory.
Yes, exactly. So just as like Pokemon evolve into these more advanced forms, there is this sense that shamanism is this precursor that eventually is like the earliest stage to a bishop or an ayatollah. And so the point that I want to make in contrast to that is that I don't think we should think about shamanism as a precursor to organized religion or these kind of more centralized, institutionalized religions, but as often a competitor or something that institutionalized religion constantly tussles with. So there are many institutionalized religions that are born from shamanism, but then quickly try to control it, curb it. So a very basic example or fun example is Mormonism. So, we can debate about to what extent early Mormonism was explicitly and definitively shamanic, but it was definitely the case that early Mormonism was ecstatic. There was a lot of healing. There was a lot of speaking in tongues. There was a lot of prophecy. Joseph Smith talks about these as among the gifts that are enjoyed by, or some of the gifts that are shared by the Holy Spirit. Brigham Young talks about his early experiences speaking in tongues and how he feels like this is an echo of early Christianity. But then very quickly in Mormonism, you see a clamp down on ecstasy, on this kind of ecstatic prophecy. And that's because it's dangerous. It means there are charismatic upstarts who are going to be introducing new dogma, who are going to be starting their own churches. And this is the conflict you constantly see between institutionalized, organized religion and shamanism, where shamanism is an experience of the supernatural that is much more raw. There's a deeper or kind of more experiential spiritual allure, but there's also everyday people who can enter ecstatic states and claim divine connection. And so the point that I wanted to make is that if we actually look through religious history, instead of seeing shamanism then shamans becoming, say, ayatollahs or bishops, we more see this cycle of competition and rivalry. And now, with the weakening of some formalized religion, or at least with many people turning away from institutionalized religion, you see a resurgence of interest in shamanism and related practices. So that's one point I wanted to make.
I don't know if that is, I'm not sure why that is, but I've gone and done some alternative healing, nothing, I was going to say nothing crazy, but nothing so exciting as to nothing so exciting as to include pig slaughtering. But, I've done the cryotherapy and some of the chiropractic and some of the acupuncture, and I did it through a reporting context. And what strikes me is that what all these alternative forms of healing or shamanism do is they pay a lot more attention to the person. It's very personal, and you feel a lot more attended to than Western medicine or probably Western religion provides.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes sense. I think that is a lot of people's experiences. So I think we can think about what's going on with religion and what's going on often with healing. I think with religion, it's kind of a less mediated relationship with the divine. So I can myself, maybe if I'm a shaman or in a shamanic community, experience ecstatic states, experience what feels like a divine connection, or I can be going to someone who themselves is very clearly and explicitly kind of experiencing this religious ecstasy. But then similarly, like you're saying, shamanic healing, I think, tends to be something. I mean, and this is one of the points I make in the book in thinking about what biomedicine can potentially learn from shamanism. I point out three things. One is that the experiences are kind of much more sensorial, they're much more engulfing. The second is that there's much more social support. There's a feeling of another human there who is genuinely invested and often trying to undergo trials to heal you. And then the last one is that the fact that it's so kind of sensorially important makes it very powerful for changing your own understanding of yourself. You come in, you have maybe certain narratives that like, I'm being tormented or, my soul is lost. I mean, it depends on your cosmology, but then the shaman creates this incredibly engulfing, rich sensory experience to help you shift your narrative about yourself. I mean, it's what psychedelic-assisted therapy is trying to do. You have a kind of an awe-inspiring experience to change your story about yourself, to escape these kind of self-constraining narratives.
And there is a big psychedelic chapter or a large component of the book. I do want to ask, the shamans or the techno shamans, the monetary shamans, the hedge wizards, Sam Bankman-Fried or Theranos, or to take one that wasn't a scam, Steve Jobs. Where does the analogy? It's striking to me that so often we reach for the idea of a shaman to apply to someone who is essentially a scam artist. Okay, that's not very complimentary, but that's why I threw Steve Jobs in there. But where does the analogy not apply? How is it very different from the actual experience of the shamans you lived with?
Yeah. So, and in the book, I'm very careful to say that these figures are not literal shamans, and I want to be very careful about that because I don't want to weaken the term. I mean, the obvious difference, I guess there are a couple. So one, the main reason they are not explicit shamans is they are not entering non-ordinary states, and typically not healing or divining. They're not understood to engage with an kind of unseen agents. I mean, maybe there's an unseen reality that they have some kind of wisdom into. But the main thing is they're not entering ecstatic states. The ways in which I do think the analogy is useful is that a lot of these figures are doing what a lot of shamans are doing, which is engaging in practices that promote this sense that they are distinct from normal humans, that they are fundamentally otherworldly. And in many cases, they rely on very similar techniques, especially self-denial. They claim, or self-denial or kind of like peculiar dietary regimes. So the Theranos person really emphasized
Holmes,
that. Yeah, Elizabeth Holmes was talking about how she lived on green juice or something like that. Green juice, which people have said is like actually literally impossible to subsist on. But, this kind of narrative that well,
it turns out her blood work always turned out fine, but then again, maybe that was because
that's right.
It was a total scam. Yeah.
Yes, right. But I remember the New Yorker piece that covered her before this whole thing happened. Even I think maybe it was Henry Kissinger. Someone had described her as being like a ghost. There was this whole narrative of she is different from normal humans, and she learned Chinese as a high school student. I forget exactly what there was, but all of these like kind of superhuman narratives. And Sam Bankman-Fried is analogous. I mean, I remember after that whole thing, after it came up that he was probably really, again, scamming people in very severe ways, that a bunch of his image that people took as indicators of him kind of being gifted were put on. So like the whole thing about his hair I found so fascinating, and I talked about in the book, where his hair is this like rambling mess, and it turns out that there's a constant dialogue and discourse around his hair in the company, and among his colleagues. We got the hair has higher expected value. And so that's all to say, I think the analogy is that these individuals that you find often in tech are trying to promote this sense that they can do something that no other human can do, or they can do the near miraculous. They can produce these decacorns. And one technique they engage in to do that is promoting this sense of otherness, and in some instances drawing on techniques that shamans have.
So decacorns being a unicorn worth $10 billion.
$10 billion, yeah.
Yes. So my understanding of anthropology is that there is to be no judgment. And yet, of course, I don't even know what that means. And of course, you have to judge. And there are moments in the book where it's pretty clear that while you're not really castigating, you can say, this seems to work for them for this reason. And then other practices, it's less clear that that's the case. Tell me about navigating that. Maybe I just have a very rudimentary understanding of anthropology, and that you don't have to have no judgments. Yeah.
I mean, you're tapping into a huge issue and debate and kind of complicated set of conversations that have been happening in anthropology for a while. So there are many people in anthropology who will read this book and be bothered by things that I say. So first of all, I say that I think that based on current evidence, we cannot conclude that shamans are often engaging with spirits. And I have colleagues who say that you cannot deny the cosmology that is being invoked. I also say that I think in some instances, shamans are being pretty explicitly exploitative. I mean, I think about shamanism as a very dynamic thing. I also think that these services can be incredibly valuable. And so the way that I have tried to do that, I have tried to be honest about how I understand shamanism, but have tried to always be thoughtful and respectful. So, I think many scholars might say, I don't think that shamans are engaging with these spirits, and say, I don't think it's necessary for me to justify why. But I spend half a chapter trying to review evidence for why I think that's the case, and trying to respect that as a worldview and kind of something to dialogue with. And so, I think my approach does diverge from that of many anthropologists, but I think many anthropologists are in some ways kind of lying insofar as they must agree or disagree with the people they're interacting with in some way, and to kind of always put on a stance of you got to respect and not question the worldview is, I think, even in some instances, kind of patronizing. Like, I want to treat other people as people who have...
do that. They wouldn't do that. They wouldn't say, please judge me as someone where my beliefs can't be falsified.
Yes, right.
Please don't have any critical thought as regards my claims. That's not what they're going for. Maybe that's what Sam Bankman-Fried was going for, because he's explicitly trying to scam someone, but not the shamans you have lived with.
Yes, and like I even talk about in the book, there is, in many of these societies, a constant conversation about who is faking, who is real, what is real. I think kind of treating this like monolithic, indigenous, unquestioned knowledge also doesn't respect the fact that these are people who are themselves often very intellectual and thoughtful and critical and having these own conversations. So I've tried to take a position that I think will get me in trouble with some people, but I think there's a use in it, and I hope that I have at least showed one way that it can be done respectfully.
Also, doesn't it advance your credibility if you demonstrate that you have the discernment and that you could bring to your audience these questions, these critical questions? Because if you only said, who knows, what conclusions can't be drawn, then when you do demonstrate the powerful effect of some of these actions, if you were of a different kind of researcher or anthropologist, maybe the reader would say, well, he's never gonna deny when credit shouldn't be given. What's his word worth?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. I mean, I think that's the case. And I think that is also what has made a lot of writing about shamanism very tricky. I think some writers on shamanism, some very prominent writers on shamanism, Michael Harner, for example. So Michael Harner is a really fascinating example. Michael Harner was an anthropologist who then essentially became kind of a neo-shamanic guru. And you look at Michael Harner's earlier work, and it's very kind of like anthropologically rich, but identifies the complicated world of shamans. He has a paper an article in Natural History magazine that was about how Shuar shamans were both sorcerers and healers, and about the complicated moral world that shamans exist in. But then he became essentially this neo-shamanic guru. He established what he called core shamanism, which is the foundation for a lot of like neo-shamanic New Age practices today. And his book about core shamanism just paints shamanism as this blissful, monolithically positive, universally simplistic schema And I think that was widely appealing, but that kind of, in my view, makes it very hard to evaluate anything that he's saying afterwards. And like I say in the book, when I myself came to shamanism, I was like a bit unsure about how beneficial or therapeutic these ceremonies were, partly because so much of the work and claims about their therapeutic effects are built in kind of a biased view, a view that wants to see shamanism as very positive. And so I had to undergo and go through my own kind of intellectual journey before I came out thinking that in many contexts there are very potentially strong therapeutic effects and there's something to learn from them.
Yeah, because the kind of person who's going to want to dedicate his life to this or live in, go back for 10 years to an isolated island on Indonesia, which can be nice, but there is fungus, is going to be the kind of person who has a lot invested in there being something there being something good there, rehabilitating the idea, rebutting the dismissals, so it is selective in that regard.
That's true. Yes. I don't know if this is what you mean, but there is a case that I myself, as someone who has gone there and spent so much time, have my own kind of investment in a particular takeaway.
Yeah, I mean, we all do, but I don't know that if you line up the world's 10 greatest experts on shaman, whatever they mean, and they're probably all shamans, but the 10 greatest in your field of anthropology, how many went in with the mindset of I'm going to explode this myth, right? I'm going to expose these people. That's probably not the mindset going in. So I have one last question. I have a billion questions to ask you, but and then I'll tell you why I asked. You've studied the Mentawai people very extensively, and you have surveyed much of the literature. In general, can we say that societies that endorse or have a robust tradition of shamanism are happier, more functional? It works for them more than societies that don't.
I don't know if we could say that. So I think, towards your last question,
give me your impressions, give me your impression from what you've seen. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I think many people would want to say that. And actually, when I have myself written about shamanism, I really think about shamanism as the way that I think about shamanism. It's a hyper compelling means of dealing with uncertainty. And it develops as people are essentially searching for other individuals to produce the miraculous. And I think of it foremost as a powerful psychological technology. And so I think those societies that have shamanism have at least one very potent way of dealing with uncertainty. Do I think that makes people happier? Do I think that makes society function better? I'm not sure. And here's why. Here's what I have in mind. It comes actually back to what I was talking about with Michael Harner, that shamanism is deeply linked to witchcraft, but also more generally agentic explanations of misfortune. In many societies, shamanism is engaged in this constant parallelism and battle with witchcraft. Shamans, in part, in many instances, derive their power from the existence of witches. You get sick, I can point your illness to an agent in the world, and then I can present myself as someone who can defeat that agent. But then often witchcraft also comes back and devours shamanism. So there are groups where shamans are understood in this very kind of like morally complicated way, because to have the power to battle witches also means the power to use witchcraft. So the Munduruku I talk about in the book, there was an Amazonian group where anthropologists would notice that shamans were constantly being executed. In Mentawai, the Sikere, the shamans of Mentawai, I think have dealt with this in their own way. They say that they have no idea how to deal with witchcraft. You want to learn how to treat your witchcraft, they're sorry. That is out of their worldview. They can deal with soul illness and spirit illness. But yeah, I guess the main reason that I'm apprehensive about saying that is that I do think that shamanic healing is deeply, not necessarily fundamentally tied to witchcraft, but often tied to fears and suspicions of witchcraft.
Yes. They have these ways, and among their ways of dealing with this is a copious amount of penis jokes, as you've documented. The name of the book is Shamanism, the Timeless Religion. It's written by Manvir Singh. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot for having me, Mike. This was a lot of fun.
Of course. Now, I will tell you, and let this be, I don't know, a possible bonus, I said, and I'll tell you why I ask. This is what I constantly think about. It is true that the lifespans of societies, Western societies, industrial societies, much longer, and there are rubrics about quality of life, like how much you're actually suffering with things that probably are favorable to Western societies. The question is, how happy are you, or how much meaning do you get out of however long your life is in a society that relies more on shamanism? And I have no way of really answering that. I don't know if there's a good way, or if there is scholarship attempting to do that. I think that most people drawn to shamanism who go to a retreat on the White Lotus or whatever will say, oh, they have so much wisdom in their life, or these insights give their life more meaning or more purpose. And we in the Western world might have this medicine that keeps us alive, but what is the quality of life? But I just, I don't have good statistics on that. I just see it as intention.
Yeah. I mean, so two things come to mind. The first is that there have been attempts to essentially get a sense of how does quality of life or well-being vary across societies, and in particular are including subsistence, non-industrial societies. And I would say that the conclusions are not as straightforward as one would think, or I would say it's still up in the air. And so one example, there's been a lot of research on depression among the Chimane, Bolivian rainforest horticulturalists. So they're Amazonian horticulturalists. They live in the Bolivian lowlands. And people have found that kind of the same things that I think are often tied to depression, or are often thought to be reasons for depression in the West, can also lead to depression among the Chimane. So in the West, we might think, oh, we're so solitary and isolated, or we're not using our bodies. But among the Chimane, those are also things that can predispose depression. So because you're so ensconced in a social network, if you lose a social connection, or you have a conflict, suddenly that can be a very strong triggering event for depression. Or because you are so reliant on your physical body and physical activity, if you get injured, that can be a much stronger predictor of depression than in the West. So I would just say, like, attempts to understand variation and well-being are a bit more complicated. And the second thing I would also say it's probably true that abundant societies, depression seeps in when you have your needs met, whereas societies that are based on scarcity, there's probably less of when you're just trying to survive, there's less of a chance of depression, although not always. Right. I mean, questions of the meaning of life, I think, are a symptom of affluence. But towards your second point, or a second point, I just wanted to quickly bring up. So people who go on these like shamanic retreats, especially people who go on these like ayahuasca retreats or psychedelic retreats with indigenous communities in the Amazon, there is constantly kind of a curation of what aspects of indigeneity and indigenous worldviews you can engage with and what you can't. And there's all kinds of interesting scholarship and interesting discussion about how people will go to these communities, but there's a lot of like, you can engage with these psychedelic ceremonies, but not with like the sorcery and witchcraft that is often tied to understandings of ayahuasca or psychedelics or shamanism, which is only to say, I think people often themselves have a kind of diluted version that is partly shaped for kind of solid economic payoffs.
Yeah. And another thing that I think about, which relates to one of our last questions. So shamanism is used to help deal with uncertainty. And in our society, what does that often is science, right? So you used to not know how the crops would grow. Now there's a lot of evidence and science and agri-science to help you with that. Or the weather, it was a great unknown, and now it's a great known, or maybe though it's going to become a bit more of an unknown when Trump cuts the NOAA staff. Fine. I do wonder, okay, so there's more certainty, I would say, fewer things that are uncertain, less of a need for shamanism. But I wonder, since there is uncertainty, the uncertainty that remains, maybe we just become worse and worse in dealing with it. So a huge amount of uncertainty in a shamanistic society, but they know there's uncertainty and they have the tools to deal with it, whereas a lot more certainty in our society, but when it occurs, it's more devastating than it is for the Mentawai.
Interesting. I guess my first thought would be that I think just as the Mentawai develop narratives and techniques to deal with uncertainty, so do people in rich industrialized Western societies. And I mean, in the book, I talk about these hedge wizards, about money managers who themselves kind of develop through a process that's kind of similar with shamans, where people want to control an uncontrollable system. There's competition among specialists, and then they develop all these techniques to present themselves as hyper compelling. So I guess I would be apprehensive about saying that people in Western societies are not as prepared to deal with uncertainty, because they have been dealing with uncertainty for a long time and have developed their own whole suite of techniques and narratives and mythologies for dealing with them.
Good point. And this is, and I appreciate this, the section of the interview where I cease to interview you about the book, but just lay my theories on you in your response. So thank you very much.
Which I always appreciate. I'm always
really
curious
good. The last
theories
question I have, or the last statement question, I've become really down on anthropology lately. I think there are a few social sciences that just don't have rigor in their statistics, but I read your stuff. I don't mean just statistics. I mean their worldview and how they do something. And the idea of the ethnography, if it's done in perfectly good faith, could maybe give us some information. But I've just read so many that it's like, all right, you talk to 8 people or 28 people and decided to tell us how the world works. Do you share any of these misgivings about the field of anthropology specifically?
Well, so I don't know if you're okay. I have so many thoughts on this. Of course, the first one is, I'm not sure how familiar you are with this, but anthropology has been undergoing a schism for decades. So I did my PhD at Harvard. At Harvard, the anthropology department split into 2 departments, anthropology and human evolutionary biology. Here at Davis, the anthropology department has 2 wings, sociocultural and evolutionary. Many departments have split over essentially this question of, is anthropology a science or is it a humanities? Is it something where quantitative approaches and cognitive science and evolutionary theory are useful, or is it something where, we should maybe take a more postmodern approach where we think that any attempt to produce generalizable knowledge is ultimately impossible. So I am a part of, I think that anthropology can be a science. I approach it as a kind of social science, try to allow it to intersect with evolutionary theory, with cognitive science. But I will say, among kind of evolutionarily oriented anthropologists, I still appreciate sociocultural anthropology to a great degree. I still appreciate participant observation, ethnography.
So are you, which one are you? Which school at Harvard were you affiliated with?
So at Harvard, I was in human evolutionary biology. Here at Davis, I'm in the evolutionary wing.
That's what I thought. But I'm saying, but you're doing field work and you're doing a lot of cultural studies.
I'm often like the most, or one of the most kind of, so anthropology right now has this, or the evolutionary wing has these kinds of field work and cultural oriented people. There are fields like cultural evolution associated famously with this figure, Joe Henrich. There's human behavioral ecology. There are like evolutionary psychologists who do field work. But so, I would say that anthropology is still trying to define itself. It's undergoing this epistemological tension. And I think I am one of the people who thinks that hopefully the future will involve a synthesis where we can really appreciate the power of quantitative methods about generalizable knowledge, about psychology and evolutionary theory, but also continue to really appreciate that putting yourself in a context, learning a lot about it, leads to a lot of insights, not only in your ability to collect a lot of data, but also to understand worldviews, to get out of your own worldview. Yeah.
Yeah, well, of course it does. And it would be a shame if we lost that. But I look at the other side of anthropology that seems less tethered to objectivity or rigorous science or whatever the non-third rail buzzwords are as threatening the overall reputation of the field. But I'm an outsider. What do I know?
I mean, I think there are many people who share your sentiment.
You should write about this for the New Yorker, because I didn't know there was that huge split. I
Interesting.
assume everyone in the field knows about it, but I just read these studies about the departments at colleges, and I don't need any percentage to not be liberal, but I read that anthropology is 100% progressive or liberal, or however you would define that. And I'm just thinking like 8% would be an okay and acceptable percentage to have as someone who doesn't identify like that. Just to tell me that, maybe there's some pushback allowed.
That's it. Yeah, I mean, I have thought about writing about this. I wondered if it was a bit
destroy your career? I don't know.
No, I don't know. I'm not sure. I thought it might come across as too parochial, but yeah, maybe I will try to write something. Maybe I'll pitch something.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much. Thanks again, Manvir Singh.